All right, tonight's Torah portion, Ki Tisa, which means when you go, or as you go. I think it's about as close as a interpretation as you can find. All right, tonight's Torah portion, Exodus chapter 30, 11 to 34, 35. These Torah portions are just overflowing with teachable material. They're like fruit trees with very low-hanging fruit, many of them. So there's so many things I can look at to teach from when I look at this Torah portion. So tonight I have 3 points that I'm going to put emphasis on from tonight's Torah portion that I think are beneficial and good for us to consider. The first point is the taking of the census that we find here in Exodus chapter 30. God instructed Moses to take a census from everyone, all of the males in Israel above the age of 20. So only those that were 20 and above. And what was the number, the final number of the census? I think 603,000 and something. How much ever, but it was over 600,000 was the final number, the final census. Now, everyone who was counted had to contribute to the work of the temple by a half a shekel. Right? Let's read about that. In Exodus chapter 30, 11 and 12. Then the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, when you take a census of the sons of Israel to number them, then each one of them shall give a ransom for himself to the Lord when you number them, so that there will be no plague among them when you number them. Now, remember, or you should recall, in regards to the story of King David, David took a census, and he did not do it in the prescribed manner. And what happened? There was a plague in the midst of Israel, and it was quite shocking. Actually, every time you read it, it's very shocking. Why would God react this way towards King David, who simply numbered his people? And there are many ideas about what happened. Well, it's very simple. David did not follow the prescribed manner by which God instructed Moses. There are many other reasons you can extrapolate, but that is the basic reason why it happened. King David did not follow Torah in regards to this most important event. Why is it very important that the children of Israel should be numbered, that there should be a census? Anyone? Why is it so important to God?
David's measuring the strength of his arm.
All right, so David did that. God didn't take kindly to it. Why, from God's perspective, was it so important for the children of Israel to be censored and to be numbered? It was important for God, but it was important for Israel. It was important for Israel to know their number of men between the age of 20 onwards. Fighting men that can stand and defend Israel. You see, it was important for Israel to know of its strength by God, at the hand of God. And therefore they were commanded to give a half a shekel, each of them. It was a ransom. Okay, the word ransom there is an interesting word. The word ransom that's used is kofar, which is where we get the word cover from. So the ransom is a covering. So when the children of Israel are counted, it's considered to be a covering. And the half a shekel is the price for that covering. You see, what does the half a shekel do? It goes towards the work of the temple. So it goes to God. It has to be directed towards the work of the temple, where God dwells. So that half a shekel was to be a kofar, a ransom, a covering. The interesting thing about the census is that it was equal among all the classes in Israel. You had people that were more fortunate in terms of income. They had more income than others, but yet the census was the same for all. How does that compare to tithing? tithing is a temple institute, right? It's something that's related to the temple. Israel were not to tithe to rabbis or tithe to local synagogues. Their tithe were to go to the temple, God's house. We sang that song earlier about the house of God, taken from Psalms 122, about God's house. Well, the tithe went to the house. But what's the difference between the census and the tithe? The census was a kofar, a covering, a ransom. The tithe is an offering. And the tithe offering is based on your particular capability to provide. In other words, it's based on your scale of income, right? So someone can tithe 10 cents because they made $1. Someone can tithe $100 because they made $1,000. So the amount of the tithe can vary. Not so with the census. The census is across the board. Everyone pays the same amount. Let's read in chapter 30 again, 13 to 16. Yeah, 30 to 16 in regards to the census. This is what everyone who is numbered shall give, a half a shekel, according to the shekel of the sanctuary. The shekel is 20 gerahs. I'm not sure what a gerah is, but it's a bit of silver. 20 gerahs. Half a shekel as a contribution to the Lord. Everyone who is numbered from 20 years old and over shall give the contribution to the Lord. The rich shall not pay more, and the poor shall not pay less than the half a shekel. When you give the contribution to the Lord to make atonement for yourselves. So you see, it's a ransom. It makes atonement. The actual half a shekel given by the man of Israel above the age of 20 is an atonement. You shall take the atonement money from the sons of Israel and shall give it to the service of the tent of meeting, that it may be a memorial for the sons of Israel before the Lord to make atonement for yourselves. Does that seem a little strange for us? A little strange to us? That this half a shekel is for the atonement. What happens at the temple, or the tabernacle in this case? What are the functions of the tabernacle? Well, one of the functions of the tabernacle is where the sacrifices are made before God. What are the sacrifices about? The sacrifices is in fact about faith. Being justified by faith. You say, wait a minute, you've gone too far. No, I haven't. I haven't gone far enough. The sacrifices that we find in the Levitical order is all about justification by faith. Because without the shedding of blood, there's no remittance of sin. The life of the flesh is in the blood. God ordained the sacrificial order, and every one of those sacrifices pointed to Jesus and what he himself would accomplish by his own faith, becoming the justifier of all. So the Israeli that approached the tabernacle with his lamb to be offered, by faith, walked away believing that his sins were forgiven. So you see, the tabernacle is all about faith. Faith in what? Faith that God will remove the guilt of your sin and even your iniquity. So, when you give your shekel or your half a shekel to the work of the tabernacle, you are contributing towards the overall atonement in that regard. Right? You're providing that the tabernacle will be sought after, would be kept, where the atonements are made, where the sacrifices, the so-called sacrifices are made. And that's why it was important that every half a shekel would go to the work of the tabernacle or the work of the temple. All right? Interesting there that the half a shekel is across the board. The poor doesn't give more or less, the rich does not give more. So God, what is God saying? That this half a shekel is important. It is critical. But I'm going to treat the atonement aspect of all of the sons of Israel on an equal plane. Not so with tithing. And with tithing, if you have more, you give more. It's that simple. All right, now we're going to look at the golden calf. We all know that in this Torah portion is where we see the most unfortunate thing to this point with Israel. They began to worship a golden calf. What happened? Well, I think we all know the story. Israel, they were at the foot of Mount Sinai. Moses went up the mountain, 40 days up on the mountain. What was he doing on the mountain? He was receiving the Torah. 40 days. Why 40 days? I have no idea. But 40 is a significant number in the Bible. It's always relevant as it relates to completion of what God is doing. We see it over and over. 40 days, Jesus fasted in the wilderness. 40 years in the wilderness, on and on and on. So 40 in that sense is a number that's important for preparation for ministry. So Moses was up on the mountain for 40 days. What else do we know about Moses and the number 40? Three sets of 40. And it was all in preparation for his ministry, right? At the age of 40, he went to Sinai. At the age of 80, he was called at Sinai. And at the age of 120, right, his ministry was over. So 40 is an important number. Now, so 40 days up on the mountain, and God provided Moses with the law. And then what happened? Moses was prepared to come down and greet Israel with the Torah, the tablets, that God himself cut with his own hand. And God said, you need to go down because those people are rebelling against me. So what did Moses do? He went down and he got completely irate and he cast the tablets before the children of Israel, something perhaps that he should not have done. In fact, God, in this Torah portion, God would instruct him that he should, with his own hands, make new tablets for the children of Israel. At any rate, they worshiped the golden calf. They decided that Moses was taking too long on the mountaintop. Perhaps the fire, the glory of God has consumed him and he's not coming back. So let's just do something else. And they took all the gold that they had, or some of the gold that they had, and they made for themselves a golden calf. Now, God determined that he was going to strike the entire camp of Israel, and that he would take Moses, and with Moses, create a new people. So God would not have been the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. God would have been the God of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Moses. And God had made that determination, right? He had made that determination. What happened? Moses intervened. Let's read here in chapter 32. First of all, in verse 10, here is what God is saying to Moses. Now let me alone. This is God speaking. Now let me alone, that my anger may burn against them, and that I may destroy them, and I will make you a great nation. So what a wonderful promise. Now Moses, there are some times when we see the humanity of Moses, and there are times when we see the divine nature that God had planned in Moses. God had instilled in Moses a bit of the divine nature. Why? Because Moses was a type of Messiah. He was a type of Messiah. Even though he made a couple blunders here and there, he was an active archetypal figure of who Messiah is. And here we see Moses denying himself the opportunity to have an everlasting name. God would have been known as Elohe Abraham, Elohe Yitzhak, Elohe Yaakov, Ve'elohe Moshe. He would have had an eternal name, because God would have made a complete new people from his descendants, from his two sons, and Moses refused it. I want you to see that. He refused it on behalf of what? On behalf of God's promises to Israel. Moses was concerned that the Egyptians would say, well, God brought them out here to destroy them, and that perhaps that was their God's purpose to begin with. Moses appealed to God. And it's an amazing narrative because God responded based on Moses' wisdom. That's sometimes hard to deal with, right? That God had fully intended to destroy Israel because of their idolatry, because of their fornication, their adultery, and offer Moses the full Monty, the full blessing. But then Moses says, no, I will refuse it. I would prefer that you would be faithful to your people Israel. Let's read it. Chapter 32, 11 to 14. So here you're seeing a whole different type of Moses, right? More courageous, incredibly wise, humble, and again, very courageous. Then Moses entreated the Lord his God and said, O Lord, why does your anger burn against your people, whom you have brought out from the land of Egypt with great power and with a mighty hand? Why should the Egyptians speak, saying, with evil intent he brought them out to kill them in the mountains and to destroy them from the face of the earth? Turn from your burning anger and change your mind about doing harm to your people. Remember Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, your servants, to whom you swore by yourself and said to them, I will multiply your descendants as the stars of the heavens, and all this land which I spoken I will give to your descendants, and they shall inherit it forever. So, Lord, change your mind about harm, so the Lord changed his mind about harm which he said he would do to his people. That's amazing. It's amazing. God changed his mind about the people of Israel. He said that he will wipe them out and he will make a new people that will be his people. And Moses pleaded with him, and God changed his mind. That last verse there, 14, is incredible. So the Lord changed his mind about the harm which he said he would do to his people. Amazing, right? So how do we deal with that? How do we treat this? What do we say? Do we feel like it's necessary for us to come up with some philosophical application to this? What do you think? What do you think? Sometimes I've heard, from time to time, I've heard people try to add some sort of a reasoning to this, sort of to protect God, to justify what he was about to do and so on. I have no need to do so. I just simply take it for what it says. God was angry. He was prepared to create a new people. Moses entreated God. God changed his mind. God can do this. He's God. He can do this. But it's a wonderful story and such a wonderful picture of Moses' humility in not accepting the opportunity to have a name beyond even Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He declined that opportunity, and he decided to be an intermediator between God and his people, which was the position that he had anyway. He was the intermediator. He was the type of the Messiah there, and he certainly acted on behalf of Israel. Now, the third point in tonight's Torah portion I want us to take a look at is where Moses inquired of God that God would show him his glory. And we see that in chapter 33. Let's read 18 to 23. 18 to 23. Yes, Moses inquired of God that God would show him his glory. What we're going to see here when we study this is that to see God's glory is to see his face. To see his glory is to see his face. And we'll make that correlation here in a moment. So let's read, what are we reading? 18 to 23. Then Moses said, I pray you, show me your glory. He didn't say, show me your face. He said, show me your glory. And he said, God said, I myself will make all my goodness pass before you, and will proclaim the name of the Lord before you, and I will be gracious to whom I will be gracious, and I will show compassion to whom I will show compassion. God announces his absolute sovereignty, and he says to Moses, I will pass by, and I will proclaim my name as I pass by. But God says, you will know my goodness as I pass by. Now God goes on, but he said, you cannot see my face, for no man can see me and live. So, to see his face is to see his glory. to see his glory is to see his face. You see how God puts it in that context. So no one can see his glory, his full glory, because you won't live if you were to see his full glory or to see his face fully. Let's read on. Then the Lord said, behold, there is a place by me, and you shall stand there on the rock. This is up on Mount Sinai. And it will come about while my glory is passing by, that I will put you in the cleft of the rock and cover you with my hand until I have passed by. So God's glory, which seems to be associated with his face, the glory of God shines from his face. You can see the glory, or one aspect of the glory, from behind. Or perhaps behind his hidden hand, you can see an aspect of God's glory, but you cannot see his full glory. Because to see his full glory is to see his face. If you see his face, you will die. Then I will take my hand away, and you shall see my back, but my face you shall not be seen. So to see God's face is to see the full extent of his glory, and from this statement, we cannot see the full glory of God. We will die if we do. So let's think about that for a moment. How does that apply to us? Well, I don't think there's any one of us here who has seen anything close to the full aspect of God's glory. Perhaps we haven't even seen a limited aspect of God's glory. Moses did. And what happened to Moses when he saw God's glory, even a limited aspect of God's glory? What happened to Moses? He shone, right? His face shone. And every time he went before God, God never showed him his face, but showed him his glory to a limited aspect, and his face would shine. Let's read about that. Chapter 34 in this same Torah portion, 34 and 35. But whenever Moses went in before the Lord to speak with him, he would take off the veil until he came out. And whenever that veil is a veil that he wore above himself, he covered his face with a veil because his face shone with the glory of God. So whenever Moses interacted with the children of Israel, there was a veil there because of the shining of his face. Whenever he went before God, he would remove the veil, apparently. That's amazing, right? He would take off the veil until he came out. And whenever he came out and spoke with the sons of Israel what he had commanded, the sons of Israel would see the face of Moses, that the skin of Moses' face shone. So Moses would replace the veil over his face until he went out to speak with him. He went in to speak with him. So that's something that we don't think about frequently or readily, that Moses wore a veil during this period, perhaps during the entire period of the Exodus, because he was constantly going before God, right? And because of his interaction in God's presence with the kavod Yehovah, the kavod, the actual glory of God, he would shine, his face would shine. And perhaps not to upset the Israelites, he would wear a veil. Consider that. Moses walking about constantly with a veil because of his ministry in God's presence. So the glory of God is what God is showing us here, the glory of God, the glory of the Lord. What is that glory? Apparently it is physical. It's not metaphysical. It's actually literal. There's some physics behind it, right? There's some mathematics behind it. It's real, it's tangible, it's measurable. It's an energy. It causes one's face to shine, but it doesn't kill the person. The person does not die from the radiation. Some sort of a radiation that we don't yet understand. Moses lived for 40 years with this radiation upon him. Perhaps the reason he was in perfect health when he died at the moment of his death was because he lived in God's presence. And perhaps this energy, this special radiation preserved his life. We don't know. But we know that Moses continually lived in God's presence. He went before God regularly to intercede on behalf of Israel. and to minister before God. And he shone with God's glory. So what about this glory? We don't know much about it. We know that it's associated with God's face, based on what God himself said. No one has ever seen his face, right? That's what Jesus said. Didn't Jesus said that, right? No one has ever beheld his face but the Son. Think about that for a moment. That Jesus, in the pre-incarnated form, before he was the Son of Man, he reigned at the right hand of God, where he beheld God's face and lived. Why? Because he was not a man in the pre-incarnated form. He existed in the form of God. He existed in the form of God, alongside the Holy One of Israel. And therefore he would live. Now, not so with us. We cannot behold God's glory, not in this flesh. But I want to say to you that the time will in fact come when we will behold God's face, when we will behold and embrace the full monty of God's glory. Not in these bodies. This body cannot stand it. Right, so Moses stood before God and beheld some of his glory, and his face shone. This radiation took him over. Right, this radiation was, but it sustained him somehow. But had he seen God's face, he would have died. I can't even begin to understand it or define it. I do know what the Bible says, that flesh and blood cannot inherit the kingdom of God or stand before God and behold his face. Not flesh and blood that's perishable, according to what Paul said in 1 Corinthians chapter 15. This perishable must put on imperishable. When this perishable has put on imperishable, then it would be said that the glory of God, or something to that effect. I didn't read it in preparation for this. But you see, Paul in 1 Corinthians chapter 15 is talking about the inheritance of the resurrected form that we will be resurrected in. In a few weeks, we'll be celebrating Pesach. Right? Pesach. It's coming up. It's not too far off. Of course, we'll celebrate unleavened bread, symbolic of our victory over sin. But then we'll also celebrate first fruits, which is what we know as resurrection. Right? So that celebration of first fruits is about resurrecting in a form, in a perfect form, that can literally stand in God's presence. Imperishable. The glory of this imperishable is not like the glory of the perishable. The glory of the imperishable is designed to stand before God, and not only stand before God, but to house his glory. Just as Moses, even seeing the side of God or the rear of God, began to house God's glory. But he could not have sustained it for very long. Well, in the new creation, in the resurrection, we will behold God's face, and therefore we will be full vessels of God's glory. The kavod, Yehovah, will fill us completely. And what will that do for us? What will that do in our lives, in our new lives? It will empower us for ministry. The picture there is Moses, a type of Messiah, a type of the church, filled with God's glory, and he shines. But man cannot behold it. He has to cover himself. And in that place of living in God's presence, he's empowered for ministry. And that's the final picture, that the church will resurrect on the day of the great first fruits, and we will fully receive the fullness of God's glory. We will see his face, and we will shine brightly. Let's go to Revelation chapter 22. The final chapter in the book of Revelation, Revelation chapter 22, I feel like I can read for you verses 1 to 5. Why not? We have time. I did good time tonight, didn't I? Chapter 22, verse 1 to 5. In regards to the glory of God, in regards to what God is preparing for humanity, yes, he's preparing you for humanity. You will resurrect in order to be his unique and special vessel during the redemption period and beyond. Beyond there being the new creation. God's light will shine through you. And there will be no need for a sun or a moon because the glory of God will fill his church. The new Jerusalem, made ready for God as a bride for her groom, will illuminate with God's glory. Why? Because God is there, and the Lamb is there. And if God is there in the New Jerusalem, and he's the source of light that emanates from this New Jerusalem, and the Lamb is there, so are you. Myriads and myriads of you, illuminating that incredible new city that will come down out of heaven. It itself will be the source of light, the source of energy for all of God's creation. Chapter 22, 1-5. Then he showed me a river of water of life, of the water of life, clear as crystal, coming down from the throne of God and of the Lamb. If the Lamb is there, then so are we, aren't we? We're the bride of the Lamb. We're there. In the middle of its streets, on either side of the river, was the tree of life, bearing 12 kinds of fruit, yielding its fruit every month. And the leaves of the trees were for the healing of the nations. There will no longer be any curse, and the throne of God and the Lamb will be in it, and his bondservants will serve him. Who is bondservants? Well, we are. Remember what Jesus said in Revelation chapter 2. Just as he overcame and sits down with his Father at the right side of his Father, the right hand of God, for those of us that will overcome, you too will sit with him at the right hand of God. That was a promise. That was one of the 7 promises. So you will sit in Messiah as he sits at the right hand of God. You will constitute who the Lamb will be on this day. Now, verse 4, they will see his face, and his name will be on their foreheads. And there will no longer be any night, and they will not have a need for the lamp, for the light of the lamp, nor the light of the sun, because the Lord God will illuminate them, and they will reign forever and ever. Isn't that wonderful? Let's read that again. Verse 4 and 5. They will see his face, and because we're seeing his face, we will be fully illuminated, full with God's glory. Remember that no one can see the glory of God according to what he said and live. But our life in this instant would be completely reconstituted. We will not live in the way we know life now. The new creation form is a whole different form of life. It's a life where we can house God's glory without the prospect of dying. So we will see his face, and we will be vessels of the full monty of God's glory. And they will see his face, and his name will be on their foreheads. What a wonderful promise. And there will no longer be any night. Why would there no longer be any night? Because of the incredible illumination that will come from Jerusalem. It will literally light up the entire atmosphere. And they will not have need of the light of a lamp nor the light of the sun, because the Lord God will illuminate them, and they will reign forever and ever. Now that's the promise of all promises, that God will illuminate us as we see his face, filled with his glory, and we will live forever and ever. And the purpose of our life at that time would be to serve God in the highest. To serve God in the highest form, in the highest place. That's heaven for us. That's the promise that's set before us. In this life, we overcome, we endure, we persevere, we overcome the difficulties that are thrown at us. And there are many, isn't there? I ministered to Pastor Masir and his family earlier today, this morning. And yes, persecution, Jesus said, you will have them. Take courage, I've overcome the world. And because he has overcome, we can overcome. So, the promises that God has set before us are outstanding and abundant, never ending, endless, the promises are, without end. so numerous, so abundant that we can't even begin to perceive the totality of what God has in store for us. And all we have to do is overcome here and now. Live our lives in such a way as to not be governed by sin, unleavened bread, overcome sin, ensure that you will resurrect at the end of that period and reign with God. Wonderful. Shabbat Shalom.